Sea of Thieves. You probably heard about it, developed by Rare, published by Microsoft, and received rather poorly at release. One of the major criticisms at the time was that the game felt empty because all it did was to get a map, dig up treasure, and sell it. The endgame consisted mostly of fashion and customization, but that was hindered by the low amount of gold you got, plus the high prices. The fun started and stopped with how you engage with the game and if you had friends to play with or not. Understandably, a lot of people forgot about SoT, but it seems with time the game was further developed, and ever since the virus hit, it has seen a resurgence. Personally, I have to say that I enjoy the game, but the initial core gameplay loop is still the same. They added a bunch of story-based missions, but all of them are fairly poorly designed, and the most amount of fun you can have is still with a group of friends fucking around on the sea.
In the very early days, we made a very basic prototype of just sailing a ship. Had a big empty ocean and a ship on there, and we proved that it was just fun to sail together. Like, you had 4 people on a ship, all of them controlling the sails, maybe the ropes, someone steering, someone keeping a lookout. And just from that one little nugget, then we started growing the game around it. So we introduced islands and treasures and skeletons and all sorts of weather effects as well to go on it.
At its core, the game is a co-op sailing simulator because it was designed from the ground up as such. The weird thing is that there aren't many games that are comparable to Sea of Thieves. Normally when you get a great game, you get a bunch of copycats, be they high budget or indie, but unlike Battle Royales or MOBAs, sailing simulators didn't have that time to shine yet. Still, there have been quite a few games that deal with sailing and pirates in the last decade or so, and I wanted to shine a light on them here. Disclaimer, as always with these types of videos, it's difficult for me to find every single example. I hope I could cover as many games that I deemed interesting, but feel free to comment on anything I forgot or you might think belongs in here. And before we go into the actual Sea of Thieves clones, I want to highlight a bunch of pirate-themed games or games that have sailing and ship combat in them. Starting of course with Assassin's Creed Black Flag. It's a game I never played, but every time I look at the ship combat, it looks so cool. Everything feels so big and bombastic, from shooting your cannons to boarding a ship up to just sailing. It's often described as the ultimate pirate fantasy, and I would agree that at least the ship combat is the ultimate pirate fantasy. Since we're already talking about Ubisoft, let's touch on 2 things: Skull and Bones and Ubisoft itself. Skull and Bones is in development hell. We don't know why, and honestly, I couldn't care less. Ubisoft developers in general are pretty good in what they do, but Ubisoft as a company is a piece of shit. Be it the excessive monetization of their franchises, the unwillingness to make new IPs relying mainly on brand recognition with AC or Tom Clancy, or the rampant sexism going on in the company. I haven't played a Ubisoft game in years, and I don't plan to. Other companies like Valve have their own set of problems, but you have to pick and choose your fights because literally every single company has weird shit going on behind the scenes. What is going on with ArcheAge behind the scenes, I also have no fucking clue, because that game has so many publishers, it's literally uncountable. I also don't know how many times the game has been released and re-release. Anyways, for an MMO you wouldn't expect ship combat, but ArcheAge has it. It's not spectacular, but it is there, and to be honest, I've never seen ship combat in any other MMO, except for Uncharted Waters Online. Uul is a MMO that focuses mostly on sea combat, trading, and sailing. It also has ground combat, but it's very strange, and the game itself is a bit grindy. I did enjoy my time with it, but I could never play beyond a certain level. Since I fell out of love with MMOs, I never tried ArcheAge. Still, it's interesting to see something so unordinary for MMOs. And unordinary or odd are words that we could use to describe the next batch of games. Sid Meier's Pirates, Pirates 101, and Archipelago. 3 vastly different games that are with a big stretch of the imagination similar to Sea of Thieves. Sid Meier's Pirates is more of an adventure pirate simulator with a bunch of mini-games connected to each other. Like Sea of Thieves, you take control over one character, but ship combat is more impersonal and from an isometric perspective. While you can board a ship, the boarding itself is a mini-game, and while you can sail to your heart's content, the game is based on an aging mechanic that is constantly driving you forward for the next mission. It's definitely an interesting game. If you didn't play it yourself, I would recommend at least watching a review about it. Another example of the SM Pirates formula is Sink Again. You can play an actual pirate, but instead of minigames it focuses way more on the grid combat and crew management. Not to be confused with Don't Sink, which is way more focused on the town management and town building aspect that SM Pirates and Sink Again don't have and don't focus on. Again, interesting games that are definitely worth a look, but have really nothing to do with Sea of Thieves. Pirates 101 is a game that you would think has something to do with Sea of Thieves, or at least some similarity to Wizard 101 because of the name, but it's strangely enough closer to SM Pirates than any other game. The game has a similar art style to Wizard 1, of course, given that it's from the same company, and is even slightly connected in the story, but other than that, it plays completely different. There is, of course, ship combat that, unlike SM Pirates or SoT, is step targeted with abilities on cooldown. There's also turn-based grid combat and a companion system which you can make stronger throughout the game. It is often considered an MMORPG, but it's probably closer to an MORPG, the difference being that one is massive while the other is just multiplayer. Massive is of course a fluid word and it will depend on how you define it. The game is quote-unquote free to play, but like Wizard 101, there are huge pay blocks that encourage you to spend money on a subscription. KingIsles is known for shady business practices, especially since they have a child audience. In 2021, they have been acquired by MGI, who of course owns Gamingo, and if you know anything about Gamingo, you know that they kill MMOs. They're often considered the locusts of MMOs because instead of investing in games they acquire, Gamingo sets up revenue goals and starts carving out the development team until only maintenance remains, generating the maximum amount of money. With no further updates, the game eventually dies out, and Gamingo or MGI acquires the next MMO to exploit, pretty much like locusts moving from one wheat field to another. And since we're getting a bit meta with this video, let me talk about how I usually find games in the similar genre or style. I ask Uncle Google. Often I type something like similar games to X, and most of the time I've heard about those games but I never played them, so I do further research. The problem is that sites that post X amount of games like Sea of Thieves don't really do their job correctly. For example, the first site I saw was 1:37 PM with 14 games like Sea of Thieves. Unfortunately, from those 14 games, maybe 2 of them have something to do with Sea of Thieves, those being Black Wake and Atlas, which we'll both talk about later. Often I have to go through several of those sites and filter out the BS because these articles are more focused on search engine optimization more than anything else. And yes, I am aware that I'm doing something similar here, but at least I'm not putting New World, Subnautica, or Secret of Monkey Island here. By the way, I have no idea how I found Archipelago, but it was listed somewhere. The game has some form of real-time strategy combat with a pirate's aesthetic, but that's basically it. I was so enthralled by this whole thing that I checked out the developer Troat, and it seems that they develop full-fledged games that still look like they are in development. This has literally nothing to do with Sea of Thieves. I just want to share it with everyone because I find it interesting how you can look for SoT style games and end up with Archipelago. Also, while searching for Sea of Thieves clones, I discovered some mobile games, but to be honest, I don't have any interest in them. The main reason is because they are often riddled with the greediest monetization tactics on planet Earth that I pretty much dislike. Nevertheless, there are some things that I found interesting about a few of them. Ships of Battle, Age of Pirates, Warship Battle is a real title of a real game on the App Store. The game itself is not that interesting, but similar to the articles with titles like X games, like insert popular game here, this title is pretty much interested in just being the most searchable game on the App Store. With 5 million downloads, I would say they achieved their goal. Given there are illicit services that can inflate those numbers, but let's assume only 10% of those 5 mil are real and 10% of those stay in the game, and again 10% of those spend the money on the game, you would still have a 5k paying customer base. That's a lot of people. Moving on to The Pirate, Caribbean Hunt, and Plague of the Dead, we have a duology of pirate sailing games, and again, the games are less interesting than the actual company behind them. HomeNet is a self-proclaimed indie developer started by a Polish developer, Miroslav Daimki, which worked on games like Earth 20XX and Two Worlds. They are hugely successful on the mobile market, and it's interesting to see how they are basically now at the forefront of gaming, trying to make a VR game about flying planes. Another interesting game is Tempest Pirate Action RPG. Here you can see that the game was chosen based on SEO, but not much more. Like the other games, it's available on Steam and the App Store, but this one actually costs money. I think this game is a bit more fleshed out than the others, since there's also a third-person combat alongside the ship combat, but yet again, the game is less interesting than the people behind them. This time the publisher's HeroCraft. HeroCraft is a Russian publisher and game developer, and they have quite a few games that are not in the general zeitgeist, but hugely successful on the mobile market. The one game that you might have heard about is Warhammer 40k Space Wolves, because, you know, it was a freemium tactics card game, and when I say freemium, I mean a hugely predatory piece of dumpster fire garbage. Still, I have to say, HeroCraft have cleaned up their act a bit over the years and removed the freemium stuff for new releases. Like the last company, it's interesting to see how companies evolve over time and become a bit better, and yet some devolve over time and get sued by the state of California. I'm not pointing fingers at Activision Blizzard Entertainment or anything, but if you know, you know. And finally, we're getting closer to Sea of Thieves clones, but I think we need to quickly mention games that are often lumped in with Sea of Thieves, those being Windward, Naval Action, Maelstrom, and King of Seas. Naval Action is more focused on the simulation side of ship combat. Maelstrom consists of more instance PvP and PvE combat, and while I did enjoy the idea, it couldn't hold my attention for long, plus the game is a bit grindy. Windward and King of Thieves are the only games that focus more on the questing and trading aspect of the pirate life, and could almost be considered spiritual successors to each other. And here is where we're getting really close to Sea of Thieves, because the next games are more focused on playing a singular character and commanding a singular ship. Blood and Gold, the Caribbean, and Pharaoh Blue are from the same developers called the Snowbird Games. Blood and Gold is based on the Mount and Blade engine, and there are quite a few reviews that mention it looks like Mount and Blade with pirates, but it's an unfinished product. This information is important because Pharaoh Blue is an early access game that is also described as Mount and Blade with pirates. So now we have two games that are half finished, set in the same genre from the same company, and the only thing I can do is sit here and ask myself, can we trust this company? And this is not the only example. We have Space Boot Studios with a game called Out of Reach, which is more of a crafting survival game with ship combat that was also released unfinished. And again, the same company released Out of Reach Treasure Royale, which takes everything from Out of Reach and throws it into a VR game. But it was also released unfinished. Same situation as before. As a customer, what I'm supposed to think about this? I'm highlighting these two examples because I think often indie companies or companies in general think they can hop on trends and hope for the best. Blood and Gold tried to hop on the Mount and Blade train, and Out of Reach tried to hop on the Battle Royale trend. That doesn't mean you as a company shouldn't make games that are similar to other games. Basically, this video is asking for more games like Sea of Thieves, but there's a big difference between Rare, backed up by Microsoft, that can eat up losses for literally years, and indie developers in the middle of bumfuck nowhere with no budget. It's important to note this because we have good examples as well. Windbound basically does the whole crafting sailing thing with its own art style, gameplay mechanics, and identity. It focuses very much on progression of narrative and gear. I mean, you literally build a bigger and better boat to move on. Breakwaters is not released yet, but it seems to be following the same path as Windbound. And just optically, it looks like its own game and not something like an amalgamation of other things that people may or may not like at the time. And time is the perfect keyword here because the Sea Dogs and Icarus franchise are very, very old. The original Sea Dogs was released in the 2000s, and while not the first pirate game ever made, it was pretty impressive for its time. They made also other games like Sea Dogs Caribbean Tales and City of Abandoned Ships, but the most interesting game from Makela is probably Pirates of the Caribbean from 2003. Unfortunately, you can't buy the game virtually, probably because of rights issues. As always with those games that are based on properties that have thousands of rights holders. The Icarus franchise doesn't have that problem, but it seems like these games have left the general zeitgeist. The idea is extremely interesting, and I would say the combat in Guns of Icarus comes as close to Sea of Thieves as you possibly can, including things like ship damage and repairs. The big difference being, of course, that we have flying ships, and it's steampunk. If someone is looking for ship combat comparable to Sea of Thieves, I would tell them to try Guns of Icarus Alliance at least, especially since the game also has co-op versus AI. Finally, we arrive at Sea of Thieves clones and Sea of Thieves inspired games, starting off with Atlas. So, Studio Wildcard. We talked about them in the Battle Royale video, but the actual company behind Atlas is Grapeshot, a sister team to Studio Wildcard that presumably is just a front. What we know is that at time of Atlas release or unveil, Wildcard had a very bad reputation because Ark had some weird things going on. For example, the game was at the time a buggy mess and they had released DLC while still in early access. My question is, why would you work on additional content for a game that is not finished or not polished yet? Releasing additional content for a game that is not done yet will automatically also have bugs that are in the base game. Basically, you're doubling your workload because now you need to fix something in two places at the same time without knowing that you might need to fix a thing only once. Fixing a problem in two places might cause further problems because the fixes might conflict with each other, exponentially increasing the workload you have to do. On top of all of that, it's extremely bad optics to sell additional content when you have yet to deliver the content that was promised in the first place. Anyways, now the game is released, but Wildcard itself is still shitting the bed with games like Ark Battle Royale. This prelude is to explain why Grapeshot as a company exists. It exists because Wildcard want to dodge their own public perception. Imagine how people would have perceived the game if Atlas was released under the Wildcard banner. It would have been insane. And even with the dodge, people found out that Grapeshot was basically Wildcard immediately. If that wasn't bad enough, on the day of launch, everything was broken. People found out that Atlas was just Ark with a skin through menus, someone hacked into the game and changed animal names to subscribe to PewDiePie, and some people spawned in tanks in the middle of the ocean. Given that now the player base is pretty low, I assume Grapeshot, or rather Wildcard, will at some point just stop working on the game, pretty much like they did with Ark Survival of the Fittest. I'm mentioning all of this because this is the perfect example of trying to hop on a trend with the addition of being shady. It should be pretty clear that Studio Wildcard want to cash in on the Sea of Thieves hype at the time. And they knew people would buy it no matter what, because people are stupid, especially if you show games at E3. And while we're talking about early access and trendjacking, we should talk about Black Wake. My experience with Black Wake was difficult. I didn't understand much that was going on, I tried my best, had a few laughs, and never played the game again. There are some really cool things that Black Wake does well. For example, you can harpoon opponents' ships, and once the ship is boarded, you can't respawn anymore, allowing one team to win over the other. I think this system works far better than in Sea of Thieves because there is no way to stop an enemy from spawning in Sea of Thieves. And while you can just hop on the enemy's ship and kill them, the spawn times are too slow and too fast at the same time. Having a system where you can actually board another ship and engage in structured combat makes it a bit more approachable. Also, your crew can be bigger than 4 people and people can join and leave your party whenever they want, which is a gigantic improvement over the Sea of Thieves garbage session system. Continuing with the early access theme, we must not forget Blazing Sails. I already talked about Blazing Sails in my Battle Royale video, but I would be doing a disservice if I didn't highlight this game here as well. Blazing Sails is basically the arena mode of Sea of Thieves mixed with VR elements like random loot on the map and the closing death circle. The game distinguishes itself by having far more weapon and ship variety, plus special mechanics like the plug on the boat that once pulled will start flooding the ship, and a water pump instead of buckets. Other than that, I would say this could be considered the closest thing to a Sea of Thieves clone, but unfortunately it isn't doing very well. I already talked about this in my other video, but I think as an indie company you shouldn't make your first game a multiplayer online game. The major reasons why multiplayer games succeed is because they either already have brand recognition, have a huge budget behind them, or they get lucky. It also doesn't help that this game is a paid Battle Royale. I do hope they succeed because I want more games that focus on cooperative ship combat, but looking at the numbers of Blazing Sails, I'm not so sure. A company that is trying to carve a name for itself first is Lava Boot Studios. They made a game called SoT, which was a mix of survival crafting, sailing, and ship combat. What stood out to me was the ship customization, and I mean ship customization that goes beyond the color of your sails and the look of your cannons. SoT's ship customization is very light. You can't really place down lamps, barrels, chests, torches, or furniture in general that will stay on your ship. And on top of that, your ship is not consistent, meaning that you have to restock every time you join the game. Anyways, the game is even receiving a sequel with improved graphics, mechanics, and more ship customization, which makes me certainly very happy. I don't think this is a clone per se, but if you are looking for something that gives similar vibes to Sea of Thieves, I recommend checking out SoT. Battlewake and Furious Seas are very interesting games since they are VR games. I can't say much about the games since I don't own a VR headset, but it seems that at least Furious Seas is really well received, and from what I could observe, it really focuses on the ship combat, which certainly is something I would enjoy. If we're looking at the art style alone, Battlewake comes really close to Sea of Thieves, yet again that's not the most interesting information about all of this. The developers of Battlewake are Servius and they are dedicated VR developers. While most of the catalog is well received, Battlewake and the follow-up title Walking Dead Onslaught had a fairly negative reception. The main reasons seem to be that the last two games have been pretty repetitive and to a certain extent unfinished. Nevertheless, I think we need more VR developers and adopters so that the price falls and the technology becomes more affordable. Having two party-themed ship combat games when I can finally buy a VR headset would certainly make me very joyful. Before we move on to the reason why this video actually exists, I want to talk about Blackstorm. Imagine ship combat like Sea of Thieves, but in space. That's Blackstorm. I can't really describe how cool this looks, but everything from character design to weapons and ships looks so slick and retro-futuristic. I would love to play the game, but unfortunately you have to set up your own servers. It's not difficult to set up your own server, but as an indie developer, if you know you can provide a server, then make your game peer-to-peer. When I say that as an indie developer, you should not make your first project a multiplayer online game, I mean that as genuine advice. You do not know what the fuck you're dealing with. I would love to play this game, like I said, but as you can see, it's not really playable. If the developers could retool this game into a single-player experience, I think they could have a chance to create a small following that can be carried over into the next project. Also, stop making Battle Royale games in general, or MOBAs for that matter. It's literally a waste of time if you don't have the money and resources to back it up. Finally, the reason why this video exists. Age of Seas. While searching for Battle Royale games, I found a game called Dig Pig Die, developed by Spanish game developer Eloquence Entertainment, but on Steam they are called Vector Bundle for some reason. Besides Dig Pig Die, which in itself is a retold game that was initially a zombie survivor game, they have a game called Criminal Bundle, which seems to be playable but not very well received. And finally, we have Age of Seas. It is still listed as Age of Seas, but the Steam page itself has no screenshots or videos, and the cover art shows the title Space Thieves Episode 1. Fortunately for us, we can go back in time with the web archive and it clearly shows us that Age of Seas existed at some point, and here we can also confirm that the company was once called Eloquence Entertainment. Age of Seas also has a Twitter and Facebook, both abandoned, but on Facebook you get an automated message telling you that they will get back to you soon, of course in Spanish. They also have a YouTube channel in which they posted the last update in 2018, and finally we have their website that can still be viewed through the web archive, but unfortunately it's broken. On that site you can also find out that they were once called Higgs Boson Entertainment. So now we have 3 abandoned games with 3 different company names and no contact whatsoever. I find that extremely interesting, and I would have loved to talk to developers about their games and why it was abandoned, especially since this game was basically the motivation for this video, but alas, I couldn't. This whole situation just goes to show that there is so much people don't see. Mobile games being hugely successful but not in the general zeitgeist, VR games existing in their own bubble, companies and games just suddenly disappearing and being left to rot, and companies suddenly becoming legit after a slew of shady behavior. Before moving on to the conclusion, I want to have a quick interlude. I often find weird things on the internet that I want to share, but making a dedicated Age of Seas video is first of all impossible, since we basically have no info on that game, and secondly, nobody would watch an Age of Seas video. If you find this interesting and want to support me, I have a Patreon up. These videos take some time to make, and I eventually want this to be my job. It would be helpful if you supported me, and also gonna punch you in the throat if you don't. aren't many games like Sea of Thieves that really focus on the co-op sailing simulation side of things. I think the closest one might be Black Wake Atlas and of course Blazing Sails. Nevertheless, there are a lot of interesting games that give similar vibes to Sea of Thieves, like Sea Dogs and the Icarus franchise, as well as games that are just interesting on their own like Salt or Archipelago. Going in, I thought I would find many Sea of Thieves clones, but to my surprise, the setting is very diverse, and Sea of Thieves, for better or worse, is a very unique game that cannot easily be copied. I hope I could show some games that might be of interest to people that like Sea of Thieves, and feel free to comment any game that remind you of SoT. As always, take care of yourselves, and have a nice day.